Let me give you another example. Suppose I said, I'm going to explain this basic principle called photosynthesis. It'll take about 10 minutes to do it. Then I'm going to divide you into groups of twos, A and B. A will teach what I said to B without any notes. You'll state what photosynthesis is. You'll elaborate what it is. You'll give at least one illustration or analogy to show how you think about it. Then you'll give one example in daily life of photosynthesis taking place. And then when you're done, the person B will tell you to what extent your explanation accorded with mine and where it seemed to diverge. So one of you is going to be the teacher, one of you is going to be learner. I'm going to take 10 minutes, then you're going to have 10 minutes to work on it. Then we'll have a little discussion about it. Well, if you do this, the students are going to have a much better idea of what photosynthesis is and isn't. And as they're doing this, you wander through the class and you listen in. You do a lot of listening in on the model that I'm talking about. Hearing, thinking. And when you listen to thinking, you hear strengths and weaknesses. You can then comment on those strengths and weaknesses whenever you want. So you could come back after the students were doing this and say, I heard three misunderstandings with respect to what photosynthesis is. Here was misunderstanding number one. Some people said this. No, that's not. Remember, I said this, so forth. You can do that. So now, because you have sort of assessed them orally while they were assessing each other, they're getting the feedback from each other, but then they're also getting feedback from you. And in the model I'm suggesting, typically the teacher gives feedback to the class as a whole, not to individuals. And you do that by noticing the problems that are occurring overall. Now, this is based, as all thinking is, on assumptions. And let me tell you my assumption here. Students tend to make mistakes that are more like the mistakes that other students are making than they are unique to themselves. That is, you don't find generally, when you teach a subject, that every student does a unique mistake you've never heard of before. Rather, you find there are predictable patterns of mistakes. You could say what they were. You can even say that in advance if you want. But anyway, you know. So what do the students need to hear? I don't believe they need to hear what their unique problems are, but rather what their common problems are and how they can work on what those problems are. This means then that one of the implications, if you follow this strategy of feedback to the group as a whole, is you write much less on individual papers. Therefore, you have more time free to think about the structure of the class and so forth. Okay, but let's go further in the overall plan. So right now, we're taking our content and we're rethinking it as a mode of thinking. But here is a problem. The next stage I say on this particular diagram, review how the ideal thinker thinks. What I really mean, I think that perhaps not the best way to say it, think about those structures that are universal in thinking that the students need to learn. Think about not just the content as a particular mode of thinking, but think about that content the way it is like any other form of good thinking. Good historical thinking is in many ways like good mathematical thinking, and good mathematical thinking is in many ways like good thinking when you're a shopper. There are certain things that you can't avoid. So that's what I'm talking about here. And this opens up into various dimensions of thinking which you take into account in designing how you're going to engage students in this thinking you want. It must be within the content, but there are elements of thinking common to all content and standards common to all content. Now I'm going to step back, leave this for a moment, and then come back to it. Let me go back to the overall concept of the content that I'm teaching. In order to make focus on standards and elements add up to something that is really well integrated, I think teachers need to come up with an organizing idea for their content. Now, in some sense, I think thinking well within the content is the basis for that organizing idea. Thinking algebraically, thinking historically. But my sense is we come into class early on and we say, this is what we're studying. This is the kind of thinking that we do when we do think within this content. And here's an idea of how you can begin to internalize it. Here's an idea how you can begin to sort of take it in. For example, suppose I'm teaching a history class, and I come in, we're going to engage in historical thinking. Now, immediately the students would wonder, well, what is historical thinking? I guess it's just like reading the history book and saying what's there. But that's not really historical thinking. That's reading the results of somebody's historical thinking. But it's not actually doing historical thinking. So I give them an organizing idea that is going to be with us throughout the course from beginning to end. And here's the organizing idea. Whenever you're thinking historically, you're telling yourself a story, or you're reading somebody else's story about yourself or others in order to make decisions about what to do in the present or the future. In other words, we tell ourselves stories about ourselves, and then using those stories, we make decisions. For example, here's an example of historical thinking. Did you ever hear anybody say this? Well, I'm going to take a writing class. I know I'm not going to do well because I've never done well in writing before. That's an example of historical thinking. It's creating a little narrative with a past and an implication into the present or future. Haven't done well before, won't do well in the future. Our historical generalizations about ourselves within the stories we tell limit us or suggest possibilities for us. They point in different directions. Now I want you to imagine something, a little experiment. I want each of you to imagine 3 history books being written about you. One is written by your best friend. One is written by your worst enemy. And one is written by your mother. Now, can you predict what's going to be in the one book that is not going to be in the other? What's going to be the difference between the story of you written by your best friend, the story of you written by your worst enemy? When the students begin to discover, well, you're going to leave out most of the positive things when you're writing it by the worst enemy, and you're going to accentuate the positive things when written by your best friend. In other words, history is selective and is written with some kind of a point of view. Now, you're doing this every day of your life. You're writing your history in your mind. And you love to talk historically. It's called gossip. And you eat it up. You love to meet with your friends and tell them what you did and how it went. That's historical talking. That's historical thinking. It may not be good historical thinking, but it is historical thinking. Furthermore, if you read a newspaper ever, that's like the history of yesterday. Now, how many things happened yesterday in the world? 1,000 things? 10,000 things? 1,000,000 things? 10 million things? Should I go higher? 20 million things? How many things get into the newspaper? What percentage? 50%? 10%? 1%? 1/1,000,000th of 1%? Who decides what to leave out? And can you do this without making value judgments? And are they using your values when they're leaving stuff out? Or are they using their values when they're leaving things out? That's historical thinking that I just did. I did some historical thinking about the news, which is a historical phenomenon. So, what we're going to do in this class is historical thinking. You're going to write historically. You're going to read historically. You're going to listen historically. You're going to speak historically. And whenever you do that, what's happening? A story is being told about the past that bears on the present and the future. And you're going to learn by the end of this course how to take apart any historical account, see its strengths, its weaknesses, its usefulness, its limitations. You are going to be skilled historical thinkers. All right, now that's a kind of example of the sort of thing I have in mind. And I can play that out in many different subjects, in sociology, in geography, in dramatics, in poetry, in literature. Here's the content, here's the thinking, and here's the idea that drives the thinking. And then that's what we're going to do in the class. Let me give one other example to move away from sort of the social to the scientific and mathematical. Suppose you were teaching algebra. You might come in and say, and by the way, one of the functions of what I'm talking about here is the pedagogical importance of convincing students of two things. One, that there is a form of thinking that the subject is going to focus on, and two, they can do it. They can have success in it. It's not mystical. It's down to earth, it's concrete, it's doable, and it's valuable. So here it is. It's intelligible, it's doable, it's valuable, is the function to me of the beginning of instruction. Or it can come across as a list. It's this and this and that and that, and then we'll do this and this, then we'll do that, and then this and this and that and that, followed by that and that and this and this. In which case it's fragmented, as most instruction ultimately tends to be, at least in the mind of the student. Not an organizing idea, but just a bunch of stuff that becomes more and more overwhelming as the semester moves on.